Is it possible to work at a mass torture and execution site without noticing what's going on? The German judge presiding over the trial of a former concentration camp secretary says it's simply beyond all imagination. Nearly 80 years after the crimes were committed, the now 97-year-old woman has been found guilty of aiding and abetting the murder of more than 10,000 people in the Stutthof camp. She was given a 2-year suspended sentence because the judges were convinced she knew about and through her work deliberately supported the killings. This is likely to be one of the last trials related to the Nazis' World War II crimes.
97-year-old Irmgard F was sentenced as a juvenile because she was just 18 when she began working as a secretary at the Stutthof concentration camp in 1943. She was given a 2-year suspended sentence.
This
is in line with what the plaintiffs wanted. The victims I represent wanted her to be pronounced guilty. They were not interested in any sort of punishment. It was about proving complicity in this monstrous number of murders. The victims were gassed, shot, or died from hunger, cold, or illness. They perished in forced marches or after they were transported to Auschwitz.
It's easy to say she was just a secretary, but her role in the heart of the camp's bureaucracy was significant.
The verdict, passed after a 40-day trial, may sound lenient to some, but many of the victims feel that justice has finally been served.
And for more, we can now talk to our political correspondent, Simon Young. Simon, tell us more about Irmgard F and her role at the Stutthof concentration camp.
Yes, she worked in the office of the camp commandant from June 1943 to April 1945. And the prosecution successfully argued that she was an accessory in the murder of more than 10,000 people because she couldn't have done that job without being aware of mass executions that were happening, but also of the systematic starvation and maltreatment of prisoners, and that by her work she had effectively helped to ensure the operation of the Stutthof death camp. Now, as we've said, she's now a 97-year-old woman. She appeared in court sitting in a wheelchair, although last year at the beginning of the trial she did actually go fugitive for a short time, seeming to try to evade justice before she was picked up by the police. For a long time during the trial she remained silent, didn't say anything, but she did eventually manage to say this, I'll just quote, "I'm sorry about everything that happened. I regret that I was in Stutthof at the time."
She got a 2-year suspended sentence after those crimes that she was complicit in. It has been criticized as too lenient. Why only 2 years, and why a suspended sentence?
Yeah, well, as we've said, Irmgard F was tried before a juvenile court because she was only 18 or 19 years old at the time of these crimes, and that has an effect on the sentencing. In fact, a 2-year suspended jail term was what the prosecution had asked for, and although that has been criticised by some of the plaintiffs in this case, and indeed some have said, well, it might have been possible to insist on a longer jail term, I don't think anyone ever expected that she would actually be sent to jail. Many experts have just said, well, you know, that wouldn't really serve any purpose.
She is 97 now. Why has it taken so long for her to stand trial?
Yes, this woman was a civilian, and for a long time such people were not considered particularly culpable, at least in the criminal sense, by comparison, of course, with uniform-wearing Nazis. So after the end of the Second World War, of course, there were the Nuremberg trials, at which some high-ranking Nazis were convicted, and later on in the 60s there were some more trials. But the general story, sadly, is that I think Germany, to a degree, lost interest in prosecuting these people, particularly people who are lower down in the machinery. That all changed in 2011 with the trial of former SS camp guard John Demjanjuk, who, as it were, despite only being a guard, was convicted. And since then, there have been a number of trials and convictions of guards and, as it were, if you like, small cogs in the machine. But, of course, very few of these people have actually gone to jail either, because in several cases the defendants died during their trials.
How has this trial been perceived here in Germany?
Yeah, I think there are those who will look at this and feel that, what purpose does it serve to send a 97-year-old woman or to pass sentence on her, and as people may say, that she didn't have a very important role, and they feel that it's slightly irrelevant. But I think the mainstream view is certainly that this does send an important message. It does have a value. It gives the victims and relatives, survivors, such as there are still a few of them, some sense at least that justice has been done. And it sends to future generations, I think, the message that human rights crimes and abuses will not be forgotten, and perpetrators will be brought to justice where that's at all possible.
So if this were the end of the road to justice for the Nazis' victims, all in all, how has Germany fared in holding the people behind the atrocities accountable?
Yes, well, it would take a while to sum all that up, but historians do say there were perhaps about 200,000 Nazi perpetrators who committed crimes during the Second World War. There have been less than 7,000 convictions of such people since the war. So it's a pretty small proportion, I think you can say. And the sad thing is that it would be a much higher number if trials like this one had begun much earlier and had been prosecuted more systematically.
That was political correspondent Simon Young. Thank you so much.
I'm joined now by a man who's often been described as the last Nazi hunter. Itzehoe is the director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Israel and has helped bring many Nazi war criminals to trial. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, a German court has just convicted an elderly woman of having contributed to the murder of over 10,000 people in a Nazi concentration camp. She was given a 2-year sentence, a suspended sentence. I know you've been following this trial. Do you consider that sentence appropriate?
It's the best sentence that we could have gotten because she's being tried in a juvenile court. That's part of the problem here. And in a certain respect, the suspended sentence is absolutely absurd, because the suspended sentence means that the sentence will only be implemented if the person repeats the crime. And obviously, she's not about to repeat the crime, nor is Bruno Day, who served as a watchtower guard in Stutthof and also got a suspended sentence.
During this trial, the defendant remained largely silent until the end, when she said, quote, that she was sorry for everything that happened. What do you make of that apology?
To my mind, it's absolutely ludicrous, because what she's apologizing for, if she didn't know that people were being murdered in Stutthof.
In our report just now, we saw a Holocaust survivor who accused the German judiciary of doing nothing for many years and then only going after what he called the small fish. Do you share that assessment?
Listen, that's a truthful assessment. But what he doesn't know, apparently, is that Hoppe, Paul Werner Hoppe, who was the second commandant of Stutthof and who was Fürsten's superior, was convicted, was incarcerated for 9 years in West Germany.
Some are saying
so. In general, it's true. In other words, his statement, in general, is true that many of the big fish got away, and these people are minor figures. But listen, the passage of time in low weight diminishes the guilt of the killers. Old age is not a excuse or a reason why people should not be brought to justice. And this is what we owe. We owe to the victims and their families that any person who was involved in these crimes, should pay for them. And I could just point out that in the previous trial of Bruno Day, also served in Stutthof, the judge, Anne Maya Goring, gave a brilliant verdict in which she explained, she ripped to pieces all the arguments against these trials. In other words, because of the advanced age of the defendant, the time that passed, the fact that more senior people of a senior rank were not brought to justice. And she basically said that in crimes of a tragedy like the Holocaust, there's no such thing as a small cog.
Right. So some 80 years have passed now. Some are saying this may be the last trial of its kind. Do you think that's the case?
Listen, over 40 years ago, a book was already written about I think it was about the Schwamberger trial, the first trial in unified Germany, and the title was The Last Nazi. I can tell you that more than 100 Nazi war criminals were convicted in the interim. So I wouldn't run or rush to call this the last trial. I know for a fact that we at the Wiesenthal Center are busy trying to find survivors from the Ravensbrück, camps in northern Germany who can testify against a person who served as a guard, both in the men's camp and in the women's camp, and is scheduled to be brought to justice in the coming months. And there are more additional investigations going on.
So your work continues. You have spent much of your life helping to bring Nazi war criminals to trial. Looking back at those years, how would you describe Germany's efforts to confront its Nazi past?
Until 14 years ago, in order to prosecute a Nazi war criminal in the Federal Republic, you had to prove that that person had committed a specific crime against a specific victim, and actually to know the name of the victim, and that their motivation was racial hatred. How can you prove a thing like that? Thank God, two lawyers who worked at the Zentralstelle, at the Central Office for the Clarification of Nazi War Crimes, Thomas Walter and Kirsten Getzer, were able to convince Kurt Schrimm, who's the director, to change the policy and bring people who were in lesser roles to trial and accuse them not of murder, but of accessory to murder. And that was actually because of what happened to the plotters of 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, who were living in Hamburg. And the German judiciary correctly wanted to bring these people to justice, but with the exception of Mohammed Atta, who actually flew one of the planes and was a suicide bomber, the others didn't pull the trigger, but they helped carry out this terrible crime. And by accusing them of accessory to justice, they could be brought to justice. And I'm assuming that they're still in jail at this point.
So are you saying that there has been improvement in terms of the at least the legal code in going after the Nazi war criminals in Germany?
No question. This change has been very, very dramatic. If the Germans had not changed the requirements to bring Nazis to justice, there wouldn't have been a single one of these 7 trials.
Okay. Ephraim Sorov, director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Israel, thank you very much for talking with us.
You're welcome.